So hello Darshan.
Hi.
So thank you for this nice introduction that you have made to the campus of the FRLHT, Foundation for the Revitalization of Local Health Tradition, which has now become the Institute of Ayurveda and Integral Medicines. So this institute, the foundation, has been established 16 years ago, and something which is not very common in a certain way. So my question would be, how have you been interested in these traditional systems of knowledge? How did you come across them? What attracted your curiosity probably first, and then this really devotion actually to go into it, try to understand it, and then promote this kind of knowledge? If you could tell us a little about this, this would be very, very inspiring and enlightening.
I think it was around 1973 that I was successful in convincing the University of Bombay to start an experimental educational program in the university. And this program was called Center for Experiential Learning. And this program offered young people who were fresh graduates from any discipline, could be arts, sciences, performing arts, medicine, agriculture, engineering. It offered young graduates the opportunity to spend 2 years living in rural communities and trying to understand what were the problems that communities faced and whether the knowledge that they had acquired from their graduate learning could be applied to try and contribute to the solution of those problems. So we call this a program for experiential learning.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted people to live in the society, live in the communities, experience, learn what is happening, what people there are doing, feeling, what is their environment, what are their resources. And it was through this program that some of the students who were working in rural tribal areas found out that tribal communities were using plants and animals found in their environment for purposes of human and veterinary medicine. And when they began to document the knowledge of the communities in particular areas, they found that the knowledge was quite substantial. So, for example, in a small administrative unit, what we call a taluka or a block, with a population of around 40,000 and maybe an area of about 30 square miles, we found that this tribal community was using almost 500 different species of plants found in their environment for healthcare. Now 500 species in that small pocket was a substantial number.
Mm-hmm.
And so it naturally raised my curiosity as to whether what they were doing was useful or not, was valid or not, and if it was, why were they not being encouraged? Because they were not actually being encouraged by the government or by the official healthcare system of the state. I found, for example, that there is a plant, and I can show that plant to you in the garden. There is a plant called Calotropis gigantea. The Calotropis species is very common. I think you find it in many countries. I have seen it in the Mediterranean region. I have seen it in the Caribbean region. I have seen it all over Asia. It's a very widely distributed plant. Now I found that, one day when I was there with a villager, he told me that, look, please take me to a hospital because his testicle, one of his testicles had swollen up to 3 or 4 times its normal size. That's a condition that is called hydrocele, where water fills into the testicle for some reason. He was alarmed and so was I, and I was just thinking that now where should I take him, who can treat him? And then there suddenly came a friend who was a local healer, herbal healer, and he said, this is no condition to take him anywhere, we can solve this problem ourselves. So I encouraged him to offer the solution, and all he did was just brought a leaf of this Calotropis plant and tied it, put a little turmeric and oil on it, and wrapped it around the testicle and asked him to wear a special kind of traditional underwear which holds the testicles in a secure position, what we call a langoti. He changed this leaf every day for 4 days, and on the 4th day the testicle was back to its normal size. So I was amazed to see this, and I then began to inquire, how do you know about this? He said, well, that's our traditional practice. Then I began to look around to find out whether there was any other knowledge system that knew about this plant. I consulted modern pharmacology. Pharmacology, as you know, is the science that tells you about the properties, the biological properties of natural materials or synthetic materials. But I found that the pharmacologists had never studied this plant for such activity or for any other activity. Then somebody told me that there is in India, my own country, a knowledge system called Ayurveda, which is documented in 100,000 medical manuscripts. And perhaps they might have some, be able to throw some light on this. So I went to a leading Ayurvedic scholar and physician in Pune, and when I asked him, he said, of course this plant is absolutely the right material. In Sanskrit, the name of this plant is ark, and the etymology of the word ark means the sun. And he said this plant has the property of the sun, and just like the sun can evaporate the water because of its heat, there is so much heat in this plant that it can evaporate water that has filled up anywhere in the body. And the testicle was filled with water and it evaporated. That, of course, we had seen earlier, a few days earlier. So I inquired about the books, about the nature of Ayurveda knowledge system, and I found that there was an amazing amount of knowledge that was documented. 100,000 medical manuscripts all over India, and dealing with pharmacology, dealing with pharmacy, dealing with the properties of plants, dealing with diagnosis, dealing with surgery, dealing with ophthalmology, dealing with the treatment of poisons, pediatric care, maternity care, gynecology, obstetrics, I, as an Indian, have been through university education, but no one ever told me that there is such a vast body of medical knowledge. And seeing this body of knowledge, and I began then to interact with many other physicians. I saw the books, and I traveled the length and breadth of India meeting scholars, physicians, and the more I met, the more respect I got, because they were all living practitioners. They were treating patients. Their entire livelihood was based on this, the Ayurvedic physicians. And at another level, what I had already seen in the communities, that in rural areas, the villagers also know about plants. They have not studied those 100,000 medical manuscripts, but they have a tradition through an oral transmission through which the knowledge is being transmitted. And I must point out that this oral transmission system is one of the most fascinating systems for transmission of knowledge. I mean, policy makers or generally social thinkers don't appreciate the fact that for centuries, ordinary people have transmitted knowledge of medicine, of agriculture, of music, of performing arts, of crafts, very sophisticated textile designs, weaving, handlooms, not through schools and colleges, but purely through oral transmission. A teacher teaches a student, what we call the Guru Shishya Parampara tradition. And that knowledge also has been evolving. It's not static, it's contemporary. It sustains rural health, it sustains rural agriculture, it sustains animal health care, it sustains the cultural vitality in the form of music, dance, performing arts. And it's reliable. I mean, if today I were to challenge modern educational institutions, saying, look, I want to see in 3 years' time, let us say, I give them 5 years' time, and I say, I want to see 1 million village-based healers properly trained. They must have training in primary health care, they must have training in bone setting, they must have training in management of conditions like hydrocele and all this. And I want to see them trained and put all over India, north, south, east, west, in let's say 5 years' time. I can extend that to 10 years. So I say, but each year I must see some progress. You don't do it all at once, but at least over a 10-year period. Can you do it? And I don't want you to use any school and no college. It should be a cost-effective method. They will throw their hands up and say it's impossible, it can't be done. But this is what the villagers of India have done, that they have transmitted. There are today about 1 million village-based healers of the kind that I told you about, who treated that hydrocele all over India, right from the Trans-Himalayas down to the coast. And they manage primary health care problems, they manage broken bones, they manage snake bites, scorpion bites, they manage eye diseases, they manage sometimes serious conditions like hepatitis, even paralysis. And none of them have been through school, some of them may be illiterate, it's just knowledge transmitted. So I saw this very rich oral stream in the communities of India, and backed up at another level by a written, documented stream, namely Ayurveda, Siddha. In the Trans-Himalayan region we call it Swarikpa, in the Tibetan plateau, and Unani. And so I was just completely sort of A, proud, but B, very humiliated that such a rich tradition of health knowledge was lying neglected, ignored. There was not enough state support, no state support whatsoever for community healthcare and for these village-based healers, and very little state support for systems like Ayurveda and Siddha and Unani and Yoga. So out of the pride and humiliation, both, that I felt, saying how can we ignore such a rich tradition, I started finding out more and decided to do something about it. And that is what resulted in the creation of this institute. But my search started in 1982. So it took me 10 years of interaction with the communities and with the written tradition and the oral tradition before I had the conviction and the insight to develop and design and start off this institute 10 years later in 1993, which is 16 years ago. So it was what I saw in the community through that experiential learning program of the University of Bombay. Of course, I must point out that it is not only in healthcare that this neglect of traditional knowledge or endogenous knowledge is taking place. It's happening in so many other fields. It's happening in agriculture, it's happening in artisans, arts and crafts and fine arts. Even in fields like mathematics, there are folk traditions. There are carpenters who know how to calculate the quantity of wood required for doing the various doors, fixtures in a house through simple formulae that has been passed down to them. And although they may not know how those formulae were actually created and formed based on mathematical principles, but they know the applications. So we have such knowledge in astronomy. So it's a very, very, what's happening is that our formal institutions like schools and colleges are hardly capturing a fraction of the knowledge that is actually available in the society. Most of the schools and colleges in this country are almost entirely based on the knowledge that is being taught is almost entirely based on Western cultural and intellectual traditions. Because this is a colonial heritage. There is no content other than language that is drawn from the rich knowledge heritage of our own society. I don't take the position that Western knowledge is bad and should be thrown out, but I am certainly critical of the fact that we are destroying very useful knowledge which represents the creativity of our people for no good reason. And I cannot obviously work in so many different fields. I would need several lifetimes to do that. So I happen to choose the field of healthcare, and that's the reason I've been engaged in this work for the last 16 years. And what we have done is very little. There's just so much to be done.
And what were for you the main challenges that you faced? Even first I would ask on a personal level, I know that you said it took you 10 years to explore all these different traditions, but I just know from my own experience that sometimes we even see things that there's some mental blocks that we have, before we can really even just acknowledge them and then maybe even go further in trying to understand them. And then once we do it, also on a personal journey in a certain way, then comes also the question of how is it received by others, and how to carve one's way in a context which does not, as you pointed out, appreciate these things.
Well, fortunately, I was a bad student of formal knowledge systems. So my schooling and my university education, I didn't take so seriously.
So it didn't spoil you too much.
So it did not condition me very much. And I was very open-minded. And so when I saw, even for the first time, I raised my curiosity and I wanted to know more, and I did find out more. And so there were no blocks in my own mind, because I recognized the reality that was there in front of me. But when I was proposing to do something about this and create some kind of organized effort to support the development of these knowledge systems, that's where I faced and continue to face problems, in that people were not policy makers, the people who could give me some resources, scientists, people from formal educational institutions, were not so appreciative or not so open to the idea of creating a foundation for revitalizing traditional medical knowledge. They said maybe it's obsolete, maybe it's unscientific, maybe it is dangerous. Why should we try to do it? We must modernize and proceed in a contemporary way. Why are we going back into the past? There's no room for traditional knowledge. We must move on. This kind of an attitude in this country is today reducing a little bit, but it is still very much there. And the evidence of that is that, for example, in healthcare, the field I work in, 97% of the national health budget goes for investments in Western biomedical health research and services and education. And less than 3% of the national health budget goes for anything to do with traditional medicine. So there is still this kind of, but at least 3% is available. It's not a situation of zero. But then this 3% has largely been going to the codified written traditions like Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, Yoga, Swarikpa, and nothing at all to the community-based traditions.
And once you have started to establish the foundation, and now talking about the people who do share an interest and see the vision and understand the vision, but who come from very different backgrounds. And we have been talking about, on the one hand, also some traditional knowledge holders, we can call them like this, who would not like to engage in a dialogue with, let's say, more institutional or modern scientists or politicians or whatever. And on the other side, we also do have some scientists who think they're open-minded, but then sometimes when they're confronted to something which does not really fit their frame of mind, do have problems actually to engage into a real dialogue. And so one of the things I would be very interested to hear from your experience is what were the challenges and maybe also the strategies or ways to find, I don't know, some space to be able to share and to really start to dialogues between these people coming from very different horizons, very different life experiences, very different knowledge experiences, and so who see some value in starting to dialogue, but then to move from just a gentle encounter, you know, to something where really work can be done and even common research can be done.
It's been a long journey in the last 16 years. in the initial years, no one, not any private donor or government, Indian government donors, were prepared to support any kind of research or training or education or even documentation related to traditional medical knowledge. I had to go by, I had to divert, you know, they say in football, you know, when you're getting crowded, the coach says, you know, change the nature of, pass the ball on to the other side, maybe away from the goal, but you have to do that. So that's what we did, that we started with a program for conserving medicinal plants. Even though our intention was to study and revitalize the medical heritage, the traditional medical heritage. But if we asked for support for revitalizing the traditional medical heritage, we were confronted with questions like, is it necessary, is it not obsolete, is it not dangerous, it may be unscientific, why are we wasting our time in doing that? But in the early 90s, when I spoke about conserving biodiversity in the form of medicinal plants, everyone thought that's a good idea, and it was not difficult to get support for conserving medicinal plants. So I had to start by diverting from my principal goal by starting a program for conservation. And we developed, we had to develop a great deal of expertise in botany and conservation and ecology and forestry to start that program. And then we began to smuggle in through that conservation program documenting of local health practices, organizing of folk healers, creating gardens for communities to use for primary health care. We had to smuggle all that in from the side.
I think I remember, I think it was something, maybe an article you wrote or we have been talking about, I'm not 100% sure, but this idea also that conservation of biodiversity goes hand in hand with the conservation of cultural diversity.
That's right,
actually.
That's right. So one had to use all those indirect means of bringing in also that relationship between biological diversity and cultural diversity and all that to make an entry into traditional medicine. But because our biological diversity work or our medicinal plant conservation work yielded very good results and was successful, and we gained a reputation for being systematic and effective and all that, that the credibility began to build up for anything else that we spoke about. So it took 10 years of conservation work on medicinal plants before I was able to start laboratories for studying plants, products, initially plants and products, but it was laboratories. It took 12 years before I could start actual medical work. Documentation, of course, I was able to smuggle in the first 10 years. So we began to work with folk healers and document their practices and traditions and start home herbal gardens for primary health care. That we were able to do. But more serious studies have only been possible in the last 6 or 8 years. So it has been a journey like that, that you know, when you don't confront, if you confront face to face, you'll get blown out, or you'll be knocked down. So you go to the side and take another route, yet to go to the same way, same place. And we are all the time been aiming for revitalizing of the medical knowledge systems, both in the communities and in the scholarly tradition, the written tradition, And today we have, been able to make inroads and start programs on all what we wanted to do, but through a long circuitous route. At this moment, the climate is much better in India, because lots of studies, not lots, but a few critical studies have actually shown the tremendous value of traditional knowledge in actually widening the perspectives of science in the field of medicine. And I could give you examples of that. And it is because of such studies that today there is much more respect and much more possibility.
And so I understand also like the originality, if we can say, like of the work that you carry out, the research that you carry out, is that you do not do what like most of labs are doing, which is like this like product testing, saying tell us what you have in Ayurveda, Siddha or Unani to treat this, and we're going to check if this does work or does not work, and then give the label of like scientific validity to some traditional knowledge. And that what you actually try to do is to really start from the traditional epistemology of Ayurveda, for example, and then from there try to design your research projects.
Absolutely. Yeah, that has been the direction of our entire work, that we have always upheld the principles of the traditional knowledge system. We are saying to people involved in the fields of scientific research that we do, like pharmacognosy and pharmacology, that the starting point has to be traditional knowledge. Today we criticize scientific laboratories working on traditional knowledge, saying if you don't have proper understanding of traditional knowledge, you cannot do scientific work on it. You must build up databases on what does traditional knowledge have to say about identity of plants, about properties of plants, about pharmacy of plants and products of plants, about treatments. We have been able now to mobilize statisticians to support what we call the whole systems approach. We will show you the journal which we have recently started publishing, and you will see from the articles in the journal that we have got a good body of scientists and statisticians, not a very large body, but a critical body of very good, particularly statisticians, who are saying it's not our business to tell a physician how to treat in his holistic way. And we would encourage traditional physicians to please treat in a customized, individualized way in which their science tells them to do so. And they assure the physicians that there is enough statistics available to try and validate your approach in its own light. You don't have to modify, reduce, distort your approach, which is what a decade ago or even 5 years ago statisticians were doing. They were used to reductionist models of research and the statistics associated with that. And they'll say, unless you simplify your approach or reduce your approach and make it similar to the biomedical approach, we can't help you. But no longer is that the case now. Some outstanding statisticians have come forward and they say statistics can deal with a completely customized approach. You need not have uniform solutions. You don't have to be doing randomized, placebo-controlled trials. The randomization is to bring in some objectivity. The placebo is also to bring in objectivity. But if that is not relevant in yoga, I mean, what placebo are you going to give in a yoga trial? So if that is not possible, we will find other ways to bring in objectivity. Either through numbers or through some other means, but that's our problem. And if we can't do it, it's our failure. It is not the failure of traditional knowledge. You must proceed in the way that your own knowledge system tells you to proceed. Don't change it. So this is beginning to happen. We call this whole systems trials.
Okay.
That is the right way to do clinical studies. If you want to do studies to establish standards of raw materials that should be used, plant raw materials, then once again we have to take into account the traditional knowledge about when a plant should be collected, where it should be collected, which season, which month, which time of the day, maybe which astronomical planetary position. If that is what traditional knowledge claims, compare that with random collection and show that that makes sense. And so far all the studies that we are doing is showing that it is making sense. It makes a big difference when you follow the traditional advice. And we are writing, and we have a culture here of understanding the nature of traditional knowledge. That in this place we don't see that nature is only physical and biological, that nature can only be understood by the scientific method. We do talk about epistemologies that are available. And so there's no surprise then that we talk of different kinds of influences that may relate to the property of a plant, including astronomical influences. We still may not know how exactly they were correlated to the property of a plant. Why should you collect this plant on a no moon day, or on a full moon day, or on a particular constellation? How that was found out, one doesn't know. But recently, for example, in Tamil Nadu, there is a certain salt that comes out of the earth near a coastal area. And according to the Tamil physicians, the traditional Tamil physicians, it is on a particular constellation, on a particular day of the entire year, at a particular time when that constellation appears, that the collection of the salt should be done for medicinal purposes. And recently a university called the Shastra University, quite a prestigious university in Tamil Nadu, their geochemical department collected that material as prescribed in the Siddha literature of Tamil Nadu and compared it with salt which anyway oozes out of the ground all the year round. And they found that there were critical differences. Now, how did the Siddha physicians come to know that the therapeutic properties will only come on that one single day of the year, within a certain period of time, when there is a certain astronomical configuration? We don't know. What was the mind set through which they recognized this? But these were great yogis. The Siddhas of Tamil Nadu were all yogis. They were people in very, very elevated states of mind, and they could see so many interconnections that perhaps in that way of knowing they discovered this, and we should be grateful for it. And we can keep trying to find out, how they did it. But the fact is that there is a huge difference between that salt. It's called Poonir. Poonir. All Tamil physicians know Poonir. It's a very, very important ingredient in their preparations. So, we respect, in the way we do work, we respect traditional knowledge. Our scientists have been exposed to traditional knowledge. We are very fortunate that we've been able to build here a team of people coming from different epistemological backgrounds, willing to work with each other in a spirit of mutual respect. So we have traditional scholars, we have traditional physicians, we have well-trained scientists, we have botanists, environmental people, ecologists, foresters, computer professionals, and all of them working together. We invite people from different disciplines to talk to us from time to time. We have even physicists here. But the spirit of the place is respect, mutual respect. So that is very important. And we are trying to evolve a framework in which traditional knowledge and science can dialogue. And this is the framework I spoke about earlier, that this is the framework in which the whole and the part can relate. We don't take the position that there can be no dialogue between whole and part. We do not take the position that reductionist knowledge is useless, or that holistic knowledge is glorious. We recognize the merits of both and the limitations also of both. The limitation of holistic knowledge is that while you may have a very good picture of a whole phenomena, you may still not have a clear picture of what is happening to the parts. Today we have modern tools that can look at parts very quickly. Let me give you a very simple example. If somebody has, let us say, a kidney stone, now there are traditional remedies for A, breaking down a kidney stone, B, for trying to flush out the kidney stone, but it is very useful to know where that kidney stone is actually located in relation to the kidney and in relation to the urinary tract. It's very, very important to know this. And a simple ultrasound, which is a physics and technology-based device, can show you the location, can show you the size of the stone, and this can help you to plan your strategy. So, whereas you may know about the phenomena of kidney stone, and if anyone knows what I'm talking about, kidney stone, when it blocks the pain is absolutely excruciating. I have been told by people suffering from this pain, women suffering from this pain who had kidney stone, that it was even worse than the labor pain that they go through. It's an extremely painful thing. Now, I think that when you combine whole and part approaches here, and you take an ultrasound, which gives you a picture of the stone, its location, its size, it is a great benefit to be able to tackle the problem. So, I think it is important today to give up the intolerance of people on both sides, on the side of traditional knowledge who don't want to have a dialogue because they have had bad experience of being abused, misused, distorted, reduced, or scientists who have arrogance that theirs is the only way of knowing, and not realizing that their way of knowing, even though it is intensive and detailed, it gives you intensity of detail of only parts, of only structures, and not of the whole. So we have to give up these extreme positions of intolerance or arrogance or feeling of abuse, and come with confidence on the table and assert that there is a relationship between the whole and the part, and it can be mutually beneficial. The part can give you a better idea of seeing and understanding the whole phenomena, and the whole can give a much, much better perspective to the part. And there are indeed some situations in medicine where the partial approach is the best approach under the circumstances. For example, if you have to undergo a surgery where you require an anesthesia. Now, anesthesias historically were derived from plants. It was from the cannabis plant that you extracted a morphine molecule. The cannabis plant also has an anesthetic effect, and its effect is very weak. No matter how much of cannabis you eat, it may dullen your senses and thus give you reduced pain. But the molecule of morphine or its modern analogues do an instantaneous job. Now it's dangerous. You've got to restrict its dosage. You can't use it for very long, and you don't need to use it for very long either. But it works very, very fast and very, very effectively. And no natural material can give you an anesthetic effect as good as that of a artificial, isolated chemical molecule which is not found in the plant. You have to extract it and isolate it and do chemical processing on the plant in order to get it. But it's useful in an acute condition. You can't function without anesthesia. In an emergency, in a surgical situation, you need anesthesia. This is the fruit of a science, of a reductionist knowledge system. The holistic knowledge system does not have the capability of giving you a fast-acting anesthetic, because whole materials do not anesthetize in that way. And so one must realize that nature is powerful in all its manifestations, in its part manifestation as well as in its whole and somewhere in between and all that. And for us to say that we want to use nature only in one way and in no other way is not taking into account the potentialities that exist in nature. But a wise person will know what to use when and for what purpose and for how long. So there is a place for parts of nature. I mean, today our entire society functions on the basis of reductionist sciences. All the materials that we use are all products of chemistry and biology. And the society is functioning. Of course, it has side effects. We can't destroy plastics easily. They cause pollution. And while they are very good materials and seem to be very cheap and convenient materials for transporting and various things, carrying various things, we now realize that we've perhaps created a monster. Even in a simple thing like hydrocarbon in the form of plastics. Of course, we hear these days that scientists are finding ways to disintegrate these plastics without toxic gases being released. We don't know. But that's the problem with reductionist science, that it can lead to problems. But you can't generalize it and say in all matters it will lead to problems. So we have to see, because there is potential in every bit of nature, the part and the whole. And we must see how to use them in a judicious manner. And certainly in medicine there is great scope for a dialogue between the reductionist biomedical sciences and the traditional medical sciences, not only of India, countries like China, India, and for that matter, Africa. The only difference between these societies is that in India and China we have written, codified knowledge, and empirical knowledge, which is oral.
I wonder also to what extent the whole question of dialogue between practitioners of the different systems is also not biased by the fact that we do have sometimes a very, let's say, academic or intellectual perspective. Then if you look at what people are actually doing, then you will see there has always been borrowing between Ayurveda and Siddha, and they were not confined to their own system. Sometimes you also construct these purities of system. And I have seen in some, not personally, but in documentaries, like for example bone setters using X-rays and these things. It's just like if you really are committed to treating your patient, you do what works, and you of course have your main epistemology, which will be your backbone actually in your work. But you are actually open to learn from other experiences. So I wonder if to what extent, and maybe it would be interesting to have your point of view of that. To what extent the problem is a problem of also, like, let's say, Western modern science and traditional medical science, and to what extent it's also a question of, let's say, of more political level. The decisions have to be taken, so they're taken in the framework of modern politics and science and so on. So you put 97% of your budget to the Western system and not to the others. But to what extent this reflects the practices of local healers. For example, in Brussels, one of my friends was doing different research on what you can call, let's say, traditional Belgian practices of healing. And he did find that actually in some hospitals, for example, when they get some very, very heavily burned people, the hospital people called certain persons who have this gift of healing burning through some prayers, these kind of things. And sometimes the person doesn't even come, they just do it by telephone. So obviously on the official level, nobody talks about this. I mean, nobody in the hospital will tell their superiors, that they're calling this other person, that in fact that's what they're doing. Because and it's just an example, but just to see that on the practical level, or people send some people, then they have somebody that they don't really know how to treat, and so they will send him to a Chinese masseur that they know that is around, or acupuncturist, So there is actually on the level of practice some already dialogue, or at least acknowledgement, that some things I cannot deal with, and better send him to somebody. But sometimes there seems to be a certain fear maybe of saying it too openly, because then you may feel that you're discredited, because you
No, that's right. What you're saying is right. I mean, at the level of, first of all, the consumers or the users, the person who's suffering, the person who has a need, you certainly see that he is willing to adopt anything that works. And so the biggest integrator of all forms of knowledge is first of all the consumer himself or herself. They are very pluralistic in their choices, and they follow a very practical and pragmatic rationality, that what helps them, what works for them, if they hear of something, they try it out, and if it works, they use it. Similarly, at the level of actual practitioners, as you pointed out, the practitioners also are quite pragmatic. It's actually at the level of formally trained scientists that there is very understandably a reservation of not accepting some form of knowledge because it does not conform to their rules of knowledge, to their ways of knowing, to their principles. I think this is quite understandable and natural, and it is in some ways necessary in order to maintain the integrity of their knowledge system. If they are arbitrary in the way they accept and acquire or assimilate or integrate different knowledge systems coming from different cultures, then they would be afraid of distorting their own knowledge system, because they are used to certain formal, systematic ways of thinking and doing things. So it is at this level that we do face difficulties, and the way out of this is really dialogue. No formal knowledge system in its tenets has anything against dialogue. In the traditional knowledge systems themselves, like Ayurveda, we have advice given in the major textbook of Ayurveda, which is called the Charak Samhita, in which Charak says that he is one of the most respected authors of Ayurveda. He says that the science of Ayurveda shall never achieve finality. It is continuously evolving. It must be open to receiving knowledge from any source, even an unfamiliar source. Must examine it carefully and see whether it can be assimilated, utilized, but it should forever be open. And so I think all knowledge systems do support open-mindedness. In practice, you don't find holders of these formal knowledge systems sufficiently open to dialogue. And therefore we need to, of course, conduct the dialogue, but we also need now people who are more open-minded than others to draw up a framework for this dialogue. And I think that really the framework for the dialogue between traditional knowledge and science, the general framework, is the framework of the relationship between the whole and the part. The moment this is pointed out and we explain how traditional knowledge is holistic in terms of its epistemology, and we recognize how science is reductionist also in terms of its epistemology, and that both provide useful knowledge, good perspectives, good understanding, and that once we accept that you can characterize them generally as holistic and reductionist, generally, of course you are now seeing developments in science that are moving towards holism, in physics, and in developments in systems biology. And there would be aspects of traditional knowledge that are reductionist. There would be certain schools that are reductionist. So generally it is the relationship between whole and part, but I hesitate to fix it and say this is always whole and this is always part. So without going to that extreme fixation, general framework is between whole and part, because the general body of knowledge here is holistic and the general body of knowledge here is reductionist. And so if we set this framework that there is this relationship between whole and part, which is quite common sense appealing, that obviously there is a relationship between the whole of something and the part of something. But then the important thing is now to discover what is that relationship. That it is not equal is also very clear. Whole cannot be equal to the part, or vice versa. Then what is it? It's not equal, but then what kind of a relationship it is? And if we move in that direction, and personally I am not really scholarly or competent enough to propose what kinds of relationships whole and part can have. I'm sure there are people better informed than me in epistemology and ontology and theories of knowledge who could propose available relationships. But that is the direction in which we have to move, to explore, and then that's a very exciting journey, because then that can open up and enrich both the whole in terms of knowledge of detail and parts, and the part in terms of perspectives, holistic perspectives. So that will be mutually enriching. So we have to push for the dialogue, but by creating framework in which the dialogue can take place. Earlier, at least in medicine in India, for the last almost more than 50 years, this framework did not exist. They were looking for a correlation between science, medical science and Ayurveda. But they were making that as an equivalent relationship, as an equal to relationship. And that created conflict. Because those who were aware of their holistic nature, even though they were not able to articulate it fully, or defend their own epistemologies, felt uncomfortable. They said, no, we are not that part. There's something wrong. And they withdrew, rightly so. And people here said, well, they are orthodox and they are short-sighted and they are not willing to change, they are not willing to modernize. In fact, I'll end this whole discussion by finally sharing my own views on modernity and tradition. In my own understanding, sociologists of this century or the last century have created an enormous amount of confusion, and historians, about the whole notion of modernity. It's absurd to say that the modern age is that age of Europe, European history from the post-Enlightenment to date. Now, that's a completely ethnocentric way of talking about modernity. In essence, to my mind, evolving tradition is the essence of modernity. Modernity comes from evolving tradition. The past, present and future lie on a continuum. The present comes from the past and the future from the present. And there's no escape from this. The present doesn't pop up from somewhere. It is a continuum, the past, present and future. Therefore, tradition and modernity lie on a continuum. Evolving tradition is what is modernity. Unchanging tradition, then it loses contemporariness. Normally in no society are the communities so stubborn as to hold on to tradition out of nostalgia. In fact, traditions are all the time evolving. They adapt and change at their own pace, with circumstances and with time, which time standing for the change in circumstances. And if there is a tradition coming from long back which is not changed, it means that it is still of use, it is still of contemporary relevance. Rarely would a community hold on to anything. I don't keep old clothes which are torn because I liked them once a long time ago. I throw them away when they are no longer useful. I don't have any attachment. I mean, there are very few people who will have attachment for something that they used to do merely because they liked it at that time when it is no longer relevant today. No one behaves in that manner. The society doesn't behave in the manner, the individuals don't behave in the manner. And so therefore there is no uniform model of modernization. The colonial and the post-colonial period have thrown up and imposed on many parts of the world a certain uniform notion of modernity. And people have been misled into thinking that modernity has to be imposed, has to be imported from a West which has been more economically successful and also politically successful. So it has been an imposition that has stunted the modernization process in many parts of the world. All societies were modernizing in their own way. Not only was there a modern age for Europe, every society between the 14th century to date has been modernizing. Somewhere along the line during the colonial period, that got a little stunted because of imposition and a political and economic imposition on the rest of society, where we began to think that modernity has to be imported from an advanced West. And the colonial West was keen to impress that, you know, you are stagnant and obsolete and all, and if you want to advance, you have to take our help. And that was a political and economic agenda, and it interfered with the sociological processes of modernization. But now the time has come to shed that, and we have to see a multicultural modernization process. And at one level of statement and affirmation in international bodies like UNESCO, we are talking of cultural diversity. And we are talking of it in the spirit that just like biological diversity is so essential for biological evolution, cultural diversity is essential for civilizational evolution. I believe that to be the case, to be true. And therefore I believe that in all fields we must now encourage endogenous knowledge, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge to express itself for contemporary, fulfilling contemporary needs. And through that multicultural flowering of knowledge systems and cultures in which they are located, will emerge a pluralistic, a multicultural modernization process that will hopefully modify the monocultural track in which world civilization has got trapped into.
And so maybe one of the challenges here, like as you pointed out before, is in a certain way to create the framework or the space where this can happen, so that the different traditions in a certain way, and I include modernity when I say tradition, so all the different traditions can also express themselves in their own ways, although dialoguing. Because one of the things that we do observe is that there is this formal recognition that which actually, like, again puts things in the pre-existing mold, which is more uniform.
But this calls for leadership. It calls for knowledge leadership. Knowledge, independent knowledge thinkers have to speak up, have to write, have to start influencing. And they can do it. But they have to work with more confidence. They have to work with more energy. All over the world, in every society, wherever there are independent knowledge thinkers, they have to speak out. Because policy makers and economists and industry are conservative and insecure and short-sighted because of that. And so they would tend to, say, well, now we must adjust within the existing spaces and so on and so forth and all this. But eventually that will not help even in their own agenda. Because when they follow a narrow track, it will wind up somewhere and lead to, obstacles and dead ends. We know in biology, it is only diversity that can ensure survival of species. Uniformity cannot ensure the survival of species. This is a well-established, recognized biological principle. Only diversity can ensure survival. If that principle is understood in socio-cultural context, that will be the opening for your own survival, for your own growth, not just survival. You need diversity. And that is the message that intellectuals and knowledge people have to put forward in different contexts, in different ways, in order to influence even narrow-minded politicians or even narrow-minded economists or industrialists.
Would you think, the thought just came to me now, because we're talking in India, which maybe is the pluralistic country par excellence, like when you compare to other countries, and where Shiva is playing a very important role, Shiva, and who stands a little for this conscious evolution or conscious change. I mean, it's through this change that actually you reach higher consciousness or broader consciousness. And you were talking about the relationship between the part and the whole that we have to re-establish. And so now we have been talking also about this maybe new horizon that maybe starts to be emerging more and more. And so I wonder if, so I never thought about this in this way, if the fact of recognizing diversity, but not only recognizing it formally, but like really taking it seriously, does not mean in a certain way to accept that we are not complete. And so let ourselves get challenged in a positive way by our own incompleteness and by the richness that the other constitutes. Robert Vachon used always to say, I like very much this little sentence, he said, when the other, we should not see the other as a void to be filled, but as a plenitude to be discovered. And the same with ourselves, not a void to be filled with all kinds of masks that we're putting on, but when we dare to look actually inside, we find that there's lots of riches there, and not only individual riches, but it's because we're connected to everything. And so all these connections will start to appear when we start to look in the part. We'll start to see how it is part actually of the whole. So maybe a final question that I will ask you, which really comes from the Indian context. This is a context of pluralism, and then Shiva being very important here. So do you also see this relationship of diversity and acknowledgement of diversity actually as a factor of, let's say, evolutionary change, in the sense of opening up of our consciousness, maybe on an individual level, but maybe also more on a collective level?
Yes, I mean, I think that is the only way, that when one becomes more aware of the nature of our existence, the nature of our life, our individual and collective life, and realize that there is an outer and there is an inner, and not only the outer. But it is knowledge systems that will, lead us into this, not as rhetorics, but as experiences, as practices, because people must experience these things. But it is only the expanding of the consciousness to realizing that there is an outer and there is an inner. And what is that inner? That will lead to more open-mindedness. I don't know how that is to be done collectively. We have traditions for individuals to pursue those paths. So I am not really competent to comment on the dynamics of consciousness spreading program and strategy. But certainly that is the direction. And that is really what knowledge leaders are, thought leaders are expected to do in their own fields, in their own ways. That's what they are expected to do. I think people like the Dalai Lama, for example, is doing a great job in spreading this consciousness. He's doing an amazing job. And I have great admiration for him, especially because I have seen the Tibetan plateau. If you go to the Tibetan plateau, this is a desert. It's a high altitude desert. A desert not on account of lack of water, but a desert on account of the lack of soil, because it's in the top of the mountain. So there's no vegetation. There's very little livestock. And it's a very frugal life. And the ordinary life of the people is a pastoral life. It's winter a lot of the year, cold, inhospitable place, simple people. The Dalai Lama is of that stock. If you see the general Tibetan populace, they are very, very simple people with very limited means. And yet in that inhospitable surrounding, habitat, monasteries grew up and went to enormous depths of knowledge through contemplation or whatever. And really when you go into that location and habitat and see, it is incredible to imagine, how in poverty of beautiful but a very poor environment, with very limited means. And even the monasteries are frugal, they are built with rocks and on bare hills. How such knowledge flowered. And this man who represents that people, if you see his people, whom he is a part of, it would be amazing, to imagine that from the desert of the Trans-Himalayas emerges a man on the world stage who is able to influence leaders and thinkers and millions of people all over the world. But we need people like that. May not be as effective as the Dalai Lama is, but if a Dalai Lama emerging from a desert and from a people of that simplicity, you don't have that knowledge in the community to that profound. They have it at a practical level, at an experiential level, but no articulation. Because they haven't been to school or college or anything. They're just leading a simple life close to nature. But if from that desert can emerge a man of such thought leadership to influence the whole world, then we who are in much better and much more fortunate conditions, why can't more people like this come out of other much better endowed areas? That's my thinking.
And so also like, to say it a little impolitely, a kick in the ass of all of us, like to get moving and actually try to...
That's right. That's right.
So thank you, Darshan, for this very, very nice talk that we had. And thanks a lot for receiving us and sharing some of your experience and wisdom. Thanks.